Okay, and you can see the colors beginning to change, and on the right we're beginning to see delta. Light blue is delta, and we're beginning to see Omicron pop up. There's some yellow stuff in South America, and these are your betas and lambdas that never did anything. But then you start seeing the orange, and this is, we had a lot of delta in 2021, as you can see. But more, what's happening in the last couple of months is it's all turning orange as Omicron takes over. Okay. And so if we look at the world today, so this is a composite picture where all these strains are appearing up to here. Okay. But now I'm just gonna change the date range to the last month, which is the most recent, and that's the world today. You can look at the Philippines, and we're kind of we've got orange spots because it's all Omicron here, but different parts of the world still have Delta. New Zealand down there has Omicron and Delta, and so the every country is a little different in what they're dealing with. But clearly, what's happening is the more virulent strains, Delta, replaced Alpha, and Omicron, which spreads better, is overriding Delta. Okay. And that's kind of a world graphic picture. Now we're going to go back into my PowerPoint. Okay, hang on a second. So the good news, though, is that the booster, which was the vaccine that we're using for a booster, and all the vaccines were actually developed from the very first strains from Wuhan. The Chinese kind of sequenced the virus back in December 2019. They sent that sequence to GISAID, and that's where the whole world got the sequence to start making a vaccine. And then it took, a year and a bit to develop the vaccine, which started getting released in 2021. So the vaccines that we've got, including the booster, are all designed for that first Wuhan strain. But the good news is Israel bought a whole bunch of vaccine. They bought it from Pfizer, okay? And they vaccinated their population early. They really had their act together. They bought it at double the price and just bought enough for everybody. So Israel is the country to watch for what's going to happen because they vaccinated first, okay? Ano, write down, ha? If you're accumulating anything. Now, Israel obtained all this Pfizer vaccine. Sorry, we're going to go back one. Okay. And 8 months later, Israel also noticed that the people who'd gotten their 2 doses of Pfizer were beginning to show a drop in antibody level. They were measuring blood from different people who'd gotten the vaccine. And they noticed that, antibody levels are going down. And that's when we started thinking about boosters. And they noticed that some people were becoming infected with COVID, and so Israel Public Health offered this third dose of Pfizer boosters initially to their elder people, and then to everybody. And when Omicron struck Israel, again, that's the country to watch for. Well, so what happened to all these people who got boosters? And so this data was published just in I think October. Lancet. This is from Lancet, December 2021. Okay. Data from the Israel population. And what you're seeing is the people who only got 2 doses of vaccine are more likely to be admitted to the hospital. And the people who got 3 doses, the blue got 3 doses, and they don't get admitted to the hospital very much. And the same thing goes for if you're in the hospital, you get severe COVID. And you can see that the ones that got the booster are all very low. And in terms of deaths, yes, some people who got the booster died, okay, but a lot less than the ones who did not get the booster. So the booster is clearly effective based on this data from Israel, okay? Why do some people die? Well, because we're not all the same. Some people just have more risk factors. And the risk factors for not doing well with COVID are your age, older people do worse, males do worse than females, socioeconomic status, poor people don't do as well. If you have diabetes, if you have chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, these are all the risk factors that just work against you whether you've had a booster or not. But you can see that if you've had the booster, you're a lot better off than the people who did not get the booster. So no question, the booster works. Hard data from Israel. Okay. Um, and then we get to the next question of, well, wait a minute. What about if you've had disease, and does disease give you natural immunity? And if you've had the disease, should you get a vaccine anyway? And so this data came out, with what they call this hybrid immunity, okay? And so this is disease recovery. These are the people who actually got sick with COVID and they recovered. And what happened to them over 6 months, over 8 months, over 10 months, over 12 months. And what they're showing here is the probability of ending up sick and developing symptoms if you had the disease already. And over time, people who got the disease become more and more likely to get it again, okay? Especially with Omicron, okay? Omicron. Here, we've got people who were vaccinated and got the booster, okay? This first one with the green bar, and they're doing really well, okay? These are the people who got vaccinated and didn't have the booster, and they're not doing so well. So if you had real COVID, last year, you're actually more protected than the people who did not get the booster worldwide, okay? And then the people who actually have the best immunity so far are the ones who recovered from natural disease and got the vaccinations. So these guys down here actually had the disease 6 months ago, 8 months ago. They've got antibody from the disease, and plus they got vaccinated, and they do the best. Okay? So that's data. I mean, you had to wait enough time to see what happens, and this is the data so far as to what's happening with people who didn't get vaccinated, and boosted. Okay? Now, what they don't show here is how many people got sick and died. That wasn't part of their question. Okay? So, should you go out and get Omicron and get it over with? Well, that's not as easy to answer, okay? If you're unvaccinated, Omicron is potentially as dangerous as Delta. If you're vaccinated and you've had 2 vaccines, it depends on your overall health and risk factors. If you've gotten boosted, well, there's still a small risk, okay? And this is where we have some other issues to look at. There's a risk to yourself. What is the probability of developing long COVID syndrome? Meaning you go out, you get COVID, you survive, you're sick for 5 days. Are you or are you not going to get long COVID, which are these symptoms of, well, there are probably 200 symptoms to long COVID. And it's 10% incidence rate in the unvaccinated population. We don't know what it is for the Omicron population. Recent studies have also shown that 6 for everybody who's had real COVID, okay, not the vaccine, but if you look at the population who's had real COVID, 6 months after the infection, 20% of them, okay, up to 50% of them, develop autoantibodies, okay? Autoantibodies are what we measure when we're looking at people with autoimmune disease. Several autoimmune diseases are lupus, rheumatoid arthritis. There's a whole series of autoimmune diseases that people have for which they need to get steroids, and they're treated with all kinds of sort of anti-inflammatory agents for life, okay? And when somebody comes into a clinic and they've got these vague symptoms and you've ruled out all the common things, you start thinking about autoimmune diseases. And there are marker antibodies called autoantibodies. And that's what they're seeing in 20 to 50% of people who've had COVID. We don't know what this is going to mean in the future. So there's this risk to yourself if you decide to go get Omicron, because we don't know what's going to happen. But we're seeing this with Delta and with Alpha and Beta, okay? I was just talking to my good friend, Deb Rothman. She's a pediatric rheumatologist. And so she gets, she works at Mass General, and she was just telling me they get called in and they're seeing something called MISC, multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children. Doesn't happen very often, maybe 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000, but the case we were talking about was a 15-year-old, perfectly normal 15-year-old female with parents who are anti-vaxxers. Child was not vaccinated. Children are getting Omicron, and this particular child had the misfortune of ending up in shock, multi-organ inflammation, and nobody knows what this is. But she was telling me, gee, every morning we have a short 1-hour conference to find out what's new about MISC. Does anybody know anything? But there are consequences to COVID that don't happen very often, but often enough to see them statistically. And MISC is just one of them, okay? And the other problem is if you go out and get Omicron, you're giving a risk to other people. If you do get Omicron, you gotta isolate for 7 to 10 days to keep it to yourself, because in addition to you getting the disease to get it over with, you're also giving the virus an opportunity to breed new variants. Meaning, where does Omicron come from? It came from somebody who got Delta, and there was a mutation, and they got Omicron. So everybody who gets natural disease has the potential for breeding new variants. Okay. Evolution and mutation are just a fact of biological life. All living things reproduce themselves, and a biological virus will mutate over time, and it will evolve. Mutation is an error in the copying the gene of the parent virus. Mutation is accidental rewrite of the viral genetic code, and you get just a slightly different progeny, okay? But the progeny virus will then mutate on its next reproduction, and mutations accumulate. And as mutations accumulate, sometimes you get a better virus, sometimes you get a worse virus, and the better viruses propagate and dominate. Omicron propagates really well. It propagates better than Delta, and Delta was a superior virus to Beta, and Beta was superior to Alpha, and Alpha was superior to the original Wuhan strain in terms of propagation, okay? Just a very quick review. What happens is a coronavirus enters your cell. There's a receptor here called an ACE1 receptor that picks it up. The virus goes into the cell, opens itself up to reveal its viral RNA. It hijacks all the machinery of the cell so that all the cell will now do is follow the instructions on the viral RNA. It'll copy the viral RNA, and it'll make new viruses. So one virus comes in and out pops 20, 30, a lot, okay? And the cell dies and all these new viruses have come out. Now the question is, are these new viruses perfect copies of the original? And most of the time they are, but sometimes they're not. And since this is going on the scale of billions, a 0.01% mutation billions of times begins to add up. So this part's a little overwhelming, but we're just going to talk a little bit about these mutations, okay? This is a schematic of an opened viral gene of the COVID virus, okay? It's a blueprint, okay? And this first part here are instructions on how to make proteins to hijack the cell and take over its machinery. This is another section that does the same thing. Here's the instructions to build the spike protein. Here's the instruction to build the membrane protein, okay? In the same way that a sentence is made of many words, words can be long or short. We have 26 letters to build words, and there are many possible combinations of our 26-letter alphabet, okay? Here's a word, A, I, it, foot, inch, ruler, cornucopia, supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. Those are all words. Some are long, some are short, okay? Very similar to this. The viral gene is like that. It's several sentences. So these white spots are where you stop reading this sentence and you start another sentence at these white parts, okay? And so there's a message there that says spike protein with a barbed edge, and there's another message there that says pole protein with a long pole, and another message that says shell coating of the protein with spots. And then you have these sections called ORFs, which are the parts that make the proteins to hijack the cell's machinery. RNA transcriptase, RNA replicase. Our cells don't normally have this, but the virus uses it to reproduce itself. So this whole sequence of viral gene has 31,000 nucleotides. Think of them as letters, okay? Now, that's actually very, very small. I mean, chromosomes, we're in the millions and trillions. But so here's the nucleotide that we talked about. It's written in RNA language. The RNA alphabet only has 4 letters instead of our 26. The letters are called nucleotides. This is what they are: adenine, uracil, cytosine, guanine. And they're abbreviated like this. And so an RNA sentence might look like this, except it's 31,000 units long, okay? So if you copied this sentence by hand, you'd make errors. You know, I mean, if we write something, we're going to make little transcription errors, okay? And those errors are mutations. Some errors are inconsequential. So if we changed one letter in supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, we'd still kind of get the meaning of the word. But if you change a letter in a short word, foot, boot, I mean, maybe a boot is a more powerful foot, okay? Root, well, it's kind of related to boot in the sense that it's on the ground, but toot, that doesn't mean anything anymore, and this is useless. So you can see that some mutations might fortify something, and other mutations create nonsense. So these are the mutations in the COVID gene over the 2 years that we've gotten information. And there's some sections, so here's our 31,000 unit gene, and there's some sections that seem to have more variation than others over time, okay? While other sections don't look like they change very much, because if you change them, those would probably be fatal mutations. But, you know, there are lots and lots of samples that have been submitted for sequencing so they can be compared. In the Philippines, this is our sampling, and it's not that different from the rest of the world. There are just some parts of the gene that like to mutate more than others. And this business of making mistakes when you copy the gene is what gives rise to mutations, and the good mutations favor evolution, okay? And this virus will infect, replicate, and evolve as long as there are human hosts available. And there are 7.8 billion of us. This virus has been evolving in humans ever since it entered human society, okay? It was first detected in December 2019, first genetic sequence, and the subsequent evolution of the genetic sequence is what's submitted, and that's where all this data come from. So by 2022, there are 3,077 variants of the virus over the 2 years. They're not all circulating because some of them have in fact died out, okay? So we're going to go back into this data, into this next strain database, and we're going to switch to a different view, which is this view of the clades. This looks a little confusing. I'm just going to change it to the time sequence. This is the world now, okay? And what we've got are lots and lots of Delta, and here's Omicron. And I'm going to play just a sequence here, which is very similar to what we played, okay? Here's the whole world, and we're going to see it from its beginning. So we're starting back here in 2020, and you can see the sequence. Here's the gray stuff is the Wuhan and Alpha 1 and Alpha 2 in 2020. And down here, so we're now in about 2020 July, and you can see all these dots are the different mutations that were already detected. They're all in the same family. But over time, you start getting new families. Here's the very first Delta, 21A Delta, back, very early. Here's Gamma that's just showing up. Here's Eta. Eta never went anywhere, dark purple. Here's Mu. Mu was detected but kind of fizzled out. Here's Kappa, the 2 green ones. Over time, we start getting, these have just died out here in the bottom, okay? Here's Omicron 21M, and over time that one did pretty well, and you can see Delta has already taken over. This is September 2021 that we're in, and over time, over the last couple of months, Omicron began to proliferate, but this is all the Delta in the world. So over time, that's kind of what happens. And you can see these are the strains that have died out, okay, but they've been replaced by these strains that are just much better at spreading. And this is a very interesting website, by the way, that anybody can go to. It's called nextstrain.org, okay? And down here is the map, which plays along with this. Down here are the genetic sequences, and this is that world picture that I showed you, okay? And this, and who knows what's, so the question that we look at now is, well, here's 2 years of history. What's going to happen as we move forward? Are these going to evolve? Are these going to evolve? It would be kind of unrealistic to expect them to just die out. So we're going back to PowerPoint. And where am I? Here we go. So that's the empirical truth. That's the data that's submitted to GISAID. Those are honest labs saying these are the viruses we see. That's the composite. And this is where I like to quote Winston Churchill: truth is incontrovertible. Ignorance can deride it. Panic may resent it. Malice may destroy it. But there it is. And this is from a speech he gave in the beginning of World War I, 2016. They were in the middle of a war. He gave a similar speech in 1940 when Britain was being bombed, saying this is just the way it is, okay? And this is what we call, the data I presented is empirical truth. It's based on observation. It's not theory. We're not deriving equations. This is what we see. And they're consistent with what we know about viruses and evolution. We know that viruses and anything that's living will evolve. And so the empirical truth is COVID-19 is propagating and mutating in the human population of the world. Continued virus evolution is inevitable. The better propagator will win. We hope that this virus goes from lethal to milder but very contagious. And so some people are saying maybe Omicron is going to be mild and that's what everybody's going to get and that's going to be the dominant strain. What happens with Omicron is the host stays alive because it's very mild, the host feels well, and so they can spread the virus to other people. But the trouble is Omicron can also break through immunity. The vaccine and the previous experience with previous viruses isn't holding as well, okay? And so, and in the unvaccinated or the immunocompromised, Omicron can be a serious illness. So Omicron is really good at what it does, and it may evolve and it may actually develop better variants to penetrate the immunized if it wants to keep propagating. So that's the bad news. The good news is we've actually been living with coronaviruses for a long time. There are 4 very old human coronaviruses, okay? And they've got numbers. They were never given Greek letters. But coronavirus 229E is an interesting example that was studied. And in this Nature paper, somebody said, gee, I wonder if coronavirus 229E keeps on coming back every couple of years. So they took blood samples going back, back into the 1980s and started looking for antibody to coronavirus 229E. And they found it. And sure enough, the antibodies had to keep changing because this virus 229E mutates and comes back to reinfect you a couple of years later. You get the same cold, but it's changed enough that you're not immune to it. And these other ones do also, NL63, okay? But these guys just give us the common cold. And so the question that we're hoping is, there are people that believe that these things were actually once as lethal as COVID-19. and they've essentially over time learned to live with us, and it's a live and let live. So there's some hope that COVID's going to do that, but we don't know when and how. Okay, here's the bad news: there are new human coronaviruses. Okay, SARS-CoV was the one in 2002, 2003 that caused the SARS outbreak in Hong Kong. SARS is an acronym for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome, or SARS. Okay, the reservoir are bats and civet cats. It's actually very related to SARS-CoV-2, but this broke out in Hong Kong. It was recognized, and Hong Kong's an island, and it was contained with good public health, and so it's gone. I mean, it fizzled. Everybody quarantined. I imagine some of you remember the story. Hong Kong public health was very strict about stay home, don't come to work, keep it to yourself. And really, if you isolate yourself and keep the virus to yourself and don't give it to anybody else, the virus will burn out in you. You'll make antibody, you'll kill the virus, and 10, 12 days later, you're virus free and it's gone. And if everybody does that, the virus disappears. And that's what happened in Hong Kong. Okay. In 2012, there was another coronavirus called Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, or MERS. It turns out this one came from camels. And so there was an outbreak in the Middle East, but also contained with good public health. Also, it wasn't that crowded. I think this was in some village or something, a couple of small villages, so it wasn't that hard to contain it. And 2019, SARS-CoV-2, and this one's out of control. It broke out in a big city, and it was Chinese New Year's, and everybody was getting on a train and going all over the place, and so this one just took off. Plus, if you remember, in 2002, 2003, China was not wide open yet. So it was easier to contain it. But with aircraft and all the air traffic, SARS-CoV-2 just went worldwide very, very fast. So, based on the truthful data that the virus is evolving and spreading, my prediction, and this is just me, is that continued COVID virus evolution is inevitable. The virus needs a host to reproduce. Epidemic will continue to evolve as long as there are available hosts. There are 7.8 billion human beings. There are so far 325 million cases reported, so 4% of the world population has had the illness. 61% of the world has had one dose of vaccine. 52% have had 2 doses, and only 11% have had a booster. So that's bad news. I mean, these are the only people immune, okay? And everybody else can still get it and spread it. So, what is the standard psychological reaction to bad news? This comes from the psychology literature. What's the normal human reaction to death and dying, or something bad's going to happen? And we've gone through this. Denial. It's not true. There is no pandemic. It is a hoax. Wishful thinking. It'll go away by itself. It'll be just like a cold. Anger. This is the fault of. Pick your group. We're all doomed. It's the end of the world. Can we accept it and think constructively? How do we adapt to this kind of bad news? Can we learn from past epidemics? And this is where we're going to do a history check. Historical lesson from previous epidemics. John, do you want to break for a moment? Am I going too fast? Unmute, please.
No, okay. I think so. You can continue.
Can we continue? Okay. I'm not over. You're following, okay?
We're following.
Okay. So, historical lessons from previous epidemics. If you're going to look at a problem, let's look backwards. Has this happened before? And of course it has. In prehistoric areas, basically the whole village got killed off. Nobody knew anything about it. And, you can look at anthropology and they'll see this. When we got civilized, ancient Greece, well, the Athenians had a plague and lost the Peloponnesian War. The Romans, they suffered something called the Justinian plague, which was probably smallpox, and 5 million people died. Middle Ages, the Black Death plague killed off 1/3 of the population. Some people say a half. and this contributed to the end of feudalism, peasant revolts, and everything changed. The colonists brought measles and smallpox to America and killed Aztec populations. And finally, in the mid 1800s, in the age of enlightenment, we figured out infectious diseases and germs. And so things began to change when we had a little bit of science. Okay. I'm sorry. So this is a graphic representation of previous plagues. Okay. This is the plague of Justinian that killed 30. Well, the kill size here sort of reflects world population compared to today's population, because the numbers were much smaller in the ancient world. Okay, but but the point is we got over all this. Okay, I'm just enlarging this a little bit, and in retrospect, we kind of figured out what caused this. This one was due to rats, and fleas were the vectors. Smallpox, we know about that now and have a vaccine. Spanish flu is influenza. It was the original H1N1, and we're going to talk about that a little later. The plague of Justinian was probably smallpox. Here's a plague that's an interesting problem: HIV/AIDS. Okay, this has been going on from 1981 to now, and it's killed about 25 to 35 million people. Okay, COVID here is left fuzzy because we don't know how many people it's going to take. These ones are all done. Hong Kong flu is actually very small, only 700. Not so many people. Okay. Anyway, an interesting part is modern scientific thinking began to reason out these plagues, and a landmark is 1850. In 1850, we had kind of discovered microbes, but hadn't quite realized that microbes were associated with disease. But there was a cluster of cholera in London, and somebody noticed, an enlightened, people were thinking rationally now. Somebody noticed that the people getting cholera all got water from the same hand pump. And it turns out this hand pump was contaminated with human sewage. The hand pump goes down into a well, and so this concept of tainted water causing disease, and they stopped using the hand pump, and I think everybody drank beer instead. But the point is, the concept of water as a vector was very, very important. And once they realized that water that was bad could set up disease, you began to get a handle on typhoid, cholera, bacterial dysentery. Okay, malaria was another one. Malaria, if you think about the word, means bad air, because people used to think the air was bad in the swamps where people got malaria. And once they figured out that the vector was the mosquito, well, gee, get rid of the mosquitoes and you'll get rid of the malaria. Get rid of the mosquitoes and you'll get rid of the yellow fever. And when they figured that out, they could build the Panama Canal, and all kinds of things got better. And they still didn't know about viruses. They just knew that the disease-carrying mosquito. Okay, so the whole concept of removal of vectors or dealing with the vectors was reasoned out before viruses were even discovered. Okay, so if we look at those same epidemics backwards, here's ancient world, and these are all these diseases, all these plagues that we talked about. But this is a very important mark, 1850, because this is where we began to figure out a whole bunch of things. Vaccines, smallpox vaccines started getting used around 1800, even though we didn't know viruses. Pasteur established that microbes caused a lot of these diseases, and viruses were finally discovered and accepted in 1900, 1930. But the point is, at this point, we began to realize that diseases are caused not by bad air, not by spirits, that it's microbes. And so these are sort of interesting epidemics to look at, what happened, because now we have some science behind us. And one of the problems with these epidemics is they're all human-to-human transmission. Influenza, this big Spanish flu, you cough. The virus lives in the droplets, and the droplets end up on on your hand, and you shake hands. And this is why when the prevention for flu is wash your hands a lot and wear a mask. A very simple mask will stop droplets. These things were not aerosol, okay? And that's why when the COVID epidemic started, they said wash your hands and put on a mask and we'll prevent the droplet spread. Nobody realized that COVID was aerosol. So this had to be stopped with a change in human behavior. Back in 1918, when we had this 1918-1919 flu, there were no antivirals, there was no flu vaccine. This had to burn through the world population. And it took out 5 million people. And that was 5 million people out of a world population of less than 2 billion. Okay? If you were to extrapolate that, 5 million out is to 2 billion as X is to 8 billion. And that X works out to about 20 million people that will die if COVID does what Spanish flu did. Okay? And that's if you let it, and this is, the Spanish flu ended because it basically went through the world population and went through some mutations. HIV/AIDS is also human behavior. The vector is human to human. Asian flu is human to human. Hong Kong flu is human to human. These are all human to human. And so we are the vectors of this disease, and this makes them very hard to cure. It's because the cure is by controlling human behavior. Respiratory, influenza, COVID, okay? And so all these things that we're doing, vaccination, mask, quarantine, isolation, that's human behavior to control the vector. If you're vaccinated, hopefully you won't get it and you won't spread it. If you wear a mask, you won't spread it, etc. Okay? We have to prevent human-to-human transmission. So, change of subject again a little bit. We've discussed the concept of random single mutations occurring over time and accumulating to accidentally evolve an advantageous mutation, okay? But something happened to create Omicron out of Delta, okay? Or to create Omicron out of, it actually didn't come from Delta. If you look at the genetic phylogeny, it came from somewhere else, okay? And so we get to this question of, well, is it possible to cross-mix Omicron and Delta and create Deltacron? Is this in fact real? This was in the news over the last 2 weeks where they were saying, gee, we're detecting genetic structure here of both Omicron and Delta. Is this a new strain to submit to GISAID? And what is this? But there are some theoretical reasons why it's very difficult for that to happen, for Delta and Omicron to cross-mix. And this thing was looked at very carefully by a bunch of different labs, and they said, no, this is a lab error. You're seeing leftover from your previous test. It's not really a new virus. And so that's considered a lab error, but it got a lot of press. One of the problems is we can publish anything we want. And so people said this is what it is, but really the scientific world doesn't think so. And we're going to talk a little bit about that, okay? In order for viruses to mix, and we're going to use here the model of influenza, because this has been very well studied, okay? And this is actually going back what caused the Spanish flu of 1918 that took out the 5 million people. And it's associated with the flu epidemics that we get, okay? Influenza is an interesting virus because there are 4 strains, okay? You'll hear about influenza A, and normally that's found in birds. Chickens and ducks are the birds that we deal with a lot because farmers raise chickens and ducks to feed us. But you can also find it in wild birds, okay? So it's really a bird flu, influenza type A, okay? There is an influenza type B, and that's a human virus. And we probably all had it. It's a very mild form of the flu. It's human-to-human transmission. It's mild. There's also an influenza type C, okay? And then there's another animal influenza called influenza type D, and that reservoir is in cattle and pigs, okay? An antigenic shift where you get to mix 2 viruses happens when you've got this avian strain, the A, and then you've got this human strain, and the 2 combine to make this new strain. And this will sometimes happen when you have a human being, imagine a human farmer who has influenza B, which is very transmissible human to human, okay? And he works in a chicken farm, and some of the chickens have influenza A. And so he either gives the chicken influenza B by some accident, or influenza A from the chicken comes to him. And so now you get an animal, either the human or the chicken, infected with both viruses. Both viruses enter the same cell, and in that same cell, as both viruses try to reproduce, they get their DNA mixed up. And when they get, RNA mixed up. And when that happens, then you'll get a really bad mutation where, RNA, a big chunk of RNA from one will mix with the other. And that creates like a really super pathogen. And when that happens, you suddenly get an influenza A strain that can now infect human beings. And since the humans have never seen that before, it spreads really fast, which is what happened in 1918. Okay, so the 1918 influenza epidemic, based on the genetic studies from, there's still tissue from that, showed that it was an H1N1 influenza, really a mixture of animal and human, and that was the first major pandemic from what's called an antigenic shift. Okay? In order to create a deltacron, you'd kind of have to do the same thing, but there's no real animal reservoir, and so they don't think so. Okay. Anyway, but this antigenic shift is bad when it happens. So far, COVID, as far as we know, you can find COVID in bats. Okay. And then the bats interact with these civet cats, which are also wild cats. And then the thinking is that one of these civet cats was caught as a wild animal and was in a market in Wuhan. And that's where a human being picked up COVID from this cat. But the real reservoir is in bats. Fortunately, we don't interact that often with civet cats and bats. Okay. But there is a paper that just came out in December 2021 that said that, there are people who study viruses. There really are virologists who look at all the different animal viruses, and there's lots of coronavirus in bats. We don't know much about the universe of endemic and potentially emerging coronaviruses. We've never looked at this that seriously. But they're distributed globally. The coronaviruses that we're dealing with, all the human ones, are called beta coronaviruses, and they're found mostly in Southeast Asia and China. That's just where they happen to live, which is why it came from there. So we've got big human viral reservoir for antigenic drift, not shift, okay? We've got, so I don't think deltacron's possible, okay, right now. But we have to wait and see. I mean, the specimens that we got, they decided no, it's a dud. But can it happen? Well, it's not impossible. But what's been submitted isn't believed. I just saw this article today, and it's very interesting. Fauci is one of the authors, along with 4 other guys. New England Journal of Medicine, December 15th. And what they're saying is, look, guys, given what we know about coronaviruses and given the potential, because, we're encroaching into the territory, humans are constantly expanding their territory, and the stuff is out there, and this is all possible. Can we, in fact, make a coronavirus vaccine that covers all the coronaviruses? We made one that covers the spike protein of the original Wuhan. Can we actually make one for all? And this is what this perspective article was talking about, that, guys, if there's one thing we got to do, it's we got to build a vaccine like that. So there, and the idea is, it's a little bit like the Manhattan Project. We have to do this because this virus is just multiplying and mutating. So this is just experts from this paper. Sobering facts. They're pretty much saying everything I said. SARS-CoV-2 is unlikely to be eliminated, unlikely to be eradicated. It will continue indefinitely in periodic outbreaks and endemics. Okay. ongoing experience with the current COVID-19 pandemic, ever-present threat of reemergence, necessitates the development of a safe and broadly protective coronavirus for all the coronaviruses. It doesn't the vaccine does not exist, but that's the target for scientific development. Because the reality is, given all this data I showed you, it's impossible to believe that it's totally incompatible with the data that this is just going to disappear. It might become benign. Omicron might be okay, not so contagious, but there's so many strains out there that what's to prevent another one from popping up, just like the flu? So what to do while we wait for a universal vaccine? And this is my personal wish list based on data presented. You got to control the human vector, human to human spread. And so everything we're doing, we have to keep on doing. And you have to cooperate with the public health guidelines, which are based on science. Stop denying it. Stop the wishful thinking. Stop blaming it. Don't be depressed. and anti-vaxxers have always been there. There were anti-maskers during the 1918 flu epidemic. There were anti-vaxxers from the time smallpox vaccine was invented. Hopefully less. And we've got to do something constructive. Okay. So we're just about done, okay? So summary, small things, viruses and mutations in a big picture of science and history. There's a lot of science now to understand it. And what can the individual do? Remember the Cold War? We all built air raid shelters, 9/11, we had contingency plans. I think even though Omicron is maybe going to fade, that you've got to have an airborne infection control plan individually per person. Keep a supply of N95s and face shields. Have a plan to work from home. Think about air exchange and what can you do to improve that. Figure out how to do sick leave in the office so that if people get sick, they can stay home and not feel guilty. Because there's going to be more, okay? Human beings have the gift of reason. We're able to understand, but humans are irrational. We're all subject to the deadly sins, anger, greed, sloth, pride, etc. And all of that interferes with reason. And you're going to need the basic temperance, diligence, patience, kindness, humility. Anyway, I'll stop there for now. Oh, plus I couldn't help this one. Computer viruses. Okay, just to show you humans. Humans make computer viruses. Humans transmit them. Humans let them into their personal computers. IT departments have been warning us all the time. It's not that different. Anyway, so infection control plan, the vaccine boosters help. Normal people need only one booster. Immunocompromised probably need a fourth booster. Mass quarantine, isolate, test. And we'll open up for questions.
Wow. Well, thank you, Tommy. It certainly got me into a depression.
Sorry.
You can all unmute now, and we shall now be open for questions. I'm going to unmute people who did not mute in the first place, but I think everybody who are now unmuted can now ask questions. Let's see, ask, unmute.
First question, John.
Okay.
Tommy, how long do the boosters last?
The data shows about anywhere from 4 to 8 months, depending on how healthy you are.
So, which means that within after 4 to 8 months, we need a fourth booster.
Well, yeah. So one way to think about do you need a booster is there something bad happening around you? Okay. So if Omicron begins to fade out, which is predicted, okay, the data from South Africa, if you look at this spike here, there's a spike and it's expected to go back down, okay, because it's going to burn through the population. And so if there's nothing going on, you sort of don't really need a booster. But if something begins to flare up again, then by all means get a booster. And hopefully,
Yes.
as time goes by, we're going to have better boosters. Because the booster we're using is the same shot that we got a year ago. Okay?
Okay.
So what places like Moderna and Pfizer are trying to do are they're making boosters more specific for Omicron.
Yeah. So
So if
hopefully
that
down the
becomes
line we get.
available, yeah. So it's very difficult for me to say, here's what we should do in the future, because I don't know what the future is going to be, other than I think this virus is going to continue to mutate. And I hope, along with everybody, that it'll mutate to something benign, but be prepared for flare ups. So, in the same way that the flu occasionally flares up and we get a flu shot every year, we're probably going to have to get a COVID shot every year. And that COVID shot is probably going to change the same way the flu shot changes. If you look at the current flu shot, there are actually four vaccines in it. You're actually getting four different strains of flu in one shot, and as time goes by, they're probably going to start doing that for COVID. You're going to get more than one strain in the shot, depending on what's going on.
Doc Tommy,
Hmm.
um,
Thanks.
Doc Tommy,
Yes.
do you think everybody's so concerned about taking the antigen test? Don't you
Hmm.
think the antibody test is just as important?
Not really. The antigen test tells you, are you carrying the virus and can you give it to other people? So the antigen test tells you what to do. If you're positive, stay home and isolate yourself and don't give it to anybody else, and hopefully it'll burn out in you. The antibody test doesn't tell you anything. It says, well, you got antibody, but how protected are you? There was one slide here that showed that if you have antibody, that you're not indefinitely protected.
So
Uh,
Marisa Shaw has her hand up. Marisa?
Hi, yeah, I have a question. Hi, Uncle
Hmm.
Tommy. Thank you for the presentation. It's great. This is Marisa from Hong Kong in our incredibly tight bubble. The world's strictest, I think it's the world's strictest COVID measures that we're taking. I wanted to ask you about a very practical question about which side actually to take the shot, because I read somewhere, people who were concerned about their heart or something could actually take a shot in their leg, and whether if the shot is taken closer to your heart, is there any kind of possible effect or risk
No, it
or so
doesn't
on?
matter. Yeah, no. The shot, when you get the vaccine, basically it's going to go into your muscle, and it really just stays in the muscle. And the muscle cells are that area where you got the shot is where you absorb the messenger RNA. It doesn't go into your bloodstream. It's an intramuscular shot, and so those muscles absorb the mRNA, and they start making a little bit of spike protein. And then once they start making spike protein and releasing it, your immune system sees that. And then your immune system is what makes the antibody. So it doesn't really matter where you get the shot. It won't affect your heart at all.
Okay, thank you.
There's another question in the chat from Carlos Chiquiamco. Are boosters different from the regular shots?
No, the COVID. Well, so what happens is there's several vaccines. There's Sinovac, there's Sputnik, there's AstraZeneca, there's Moderna, there's Pfizer, and um, in the beginning a year ago, the advice was get whatever vaccine you can get because something is better than nothing. Over time, it's been shown that the mRNA vaccines, which are basically your Moderna and Pfizer, give you a much higher antibody titer than the Sinovac or the AstraZeneca. So, if you can get one of the mRNA vaccines as your booster, it's better. You'll mount a higher antibody response. If you can't get an mRNA booster and you can get an something else, well, go ahead. It's better than nothing, but the mRNA ones work the best as boosters.
Thank you. Another question from Joanna Fong. Are you seeing strange things in folks reacting to third dose vaccine? Her friend was diagnosed with PMR, polymyalgia rheumatica, after the third dose.
Um, Honestly, I'm actually retired from clinical medicine, so I haven't seen any cases. And over the last year, I've been doing, basically a lot of testing. Okay, and what you have to look at for a question like that is not an individual doctor's personal experience, but what does the data say? There's a huge system for reporting adverse effects after a vaccine. When you get your vaccine, at least when I got my vaccine, and I think when many people get the vaccine, you're usually provided with a number or a website where you can report a reaction. Okay? And all that data from all over the country is compiled, and then you can see whether or not it has to be submitted to the statisticians and the epidemiologists to decide whether there is in fact an adverse effect directly related to the vaccine. Because you have to imagine that when you're giving this vaccine to 100 million people, okay, well, they're all different. And there's somebody, for example, who's going to have a heart attack because they've got bad coronary artery disease. They get a vaccine, and then they get the heart attack that they were going to have anyway. Is that from the vaccine or not? If somebody was going to get polymyalgia rheumatica anyway, and they got the vaccine before it was diagnosed, is it the vaccine that did it? I mean, everything we know about polymyalgia rheumatica says that, well, it's going to happen to a small percentage of the population, and it's probably just bad luck that she got diagnosed with PMR after she got the vaccine. But as far as I know, there's no statistical relation. And believe me, these are looked at very carefully. Data's compiled all over the place. And so there are some reactions they're seeing. They're saying that, we're seeing that when you give an mRNA vaccine to children, there's a very small risk of developing myocarditis. There are enough cases of that to make that correlation. But they also say, but the myocarditis goes away in 3 days and the child's fine. And so it's not worth not vaccinating. The risk from the disease is much, much worse than the risk for 3 days of myocarditis, which goes away on its own. So, no, the vaccines are actually incredibly safe. They've been given to hundreds of millions of people, and they're worth it given the risks of getting the real disease and the things that we're seeing associated with the real disease.
So we have another question. Is there Delta still in the Philippines or maybe in the world?
Well, the reports from the Philippines, there's still Delta all over the world, yeah. And that's what we showed in that map. If you look at that, the map from NextStrain,
Yeah.
you can see that it's a mixed picture right now. But if we look at the same map in a month, you might find that Delta is disappearing and it's mostly Omicron. That seems to be what's happening because Omicron is so much more contagious. But it's still there.
And Benny has his hand raised.
Yeah, I just want to thank Tommy for a really well-prepared, very interesting and illuminating talk. Thanks, Tommy.
Thank you, Nene.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's actually fun to keep up with all this.
All right, Tommy.
Benny has a question.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Tommy, just a quick one. With regards to the timeline from the time, let's say you're exposed to the virus, when is it detectable by the tests, and at what point do you become infectious?
Well, I wish I could give you a straight answer for that, but there are several variables, okay? One variable is how much virus were you exposed to? Did you inhale 100 viral particles? 1,000? 10,000? The more viral particles you inhaled, the faster all these things will happen. So there's no tight answer of 2 days or 4 days. It's, this is a very contagious virus, so it turns out you don't have to inhale very much of it to get sick. But, so there's no tight answer to that, okay? But the general thinking is if you're exposed on day 1 and you're going to get sick, you're going to be transmitting the virus on day 2 and day 3 when you're feeling just fine. So it's very contagious. And then you'll probably start feeling sick. You'll probably be detectable on day 3, when they put an antigen swab in your nose. And you'll already have given it to several people by that time, by the time it's detectable in your antigen swab. That's one of the problems. The antigen swab requires a fair amount of virus to be able to detect it. If you get a PCR test, that needs a lot less virus. So, on day 2, you might see positive PCR, but you won't see a positive antigen until day 3.
Yes.
But you're contaminating people between day 2 and day 3, day 1, 2, and
Okay.
3 actually. And then, how long are you shedding the virus for? Because some people get sick, really sick, some people don't. You've got this recommendation for most people who are generally healthy, you're going to be feeling Omicron for about 5 days. And then at 5 days, you feel well, but you're probably still shedding virus. So they tell you wear a mask. You can go out and go to work, but wear a mask because you're still shedding virus. And you can stop wearing a mask at day 10. But literature, from a couple of weeks ago says, about 10% of the people are still shedding virus on day 11.
Tommy, so what do you think of the very, very strict rules we have in Hong Kong?
Well, they work, but Hong Kong has a very interesting problem. According to the OTP literature, OTP is a very good medical group in Hong Kong that publishes a newsletter periodically. And what's happening in Hong Kong is because your borders are so tight, okay, you've actually created a near zero COVID in Hong Kong. And since the population are not seeing the COVID, a lot of people aren't getting vaccinated. Oh, why should I get vaccinated and worry about the side effects of the vaccine because there's no COVID here? So the problem in Hong Kong is because it's so tight and so controlled, your vaccination rate isn't as good as it should be. So when Omicron breaks through, which it will, it's going to spread like wildfire because you've got an unvaccinated population. I mean, it's going to spread like wildfire, but also have a lot of people get sick because you've got a lot of people who haven't bothered to get vaccinated.
Tommy,
Yeah.
I suggest you do a weekly Ask Dr. Tommy show, like a half
no.
an hour.
I was preparing for this for 2.5 weeks, and
No.
There's a question from Tony Torres. Tony.
Tony.
Hi, Tommy.
Hi,
How soon
hi.
can one take a booster after recovering from Omicron? At least for my son who just recently got it 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, the idea is get a booster when you're no longer shedding the virus. So that's usually about 10 to 12 days. 10 days minimum.
Okay, thanks.
And one of the reasons is you don't want to give the Omicron to the person vaccinating.
Right. Okay, understood. Thank
You're
you,
still
Tony.
shedding the virus.
Well,
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome.
Thanks, Tommy.
Yeah.
Tom,
Jerry.
The booster is 2 weeks after the end or 2 weeks after the first time you displayed some illness?
Oh, okay. So you're saying you've already had you've had Omicron already,
Yes.
and you're feeling better.
No. Yeah. And when should you get the booster?
When you're feeling fine. So that's why they're saying about 10 to 12 days. For most, again, not everybody's the same. Okay, one of the dangers of giving advice to 100 people is not the 100 people are not all the same. So one way of looking at it is when you get your booster, you should feel fine. You should feel completely recovered, no symptoms at all. And you should probably have 5 days of feeling like that to make sure you're not giving the virus to anybody else. So we're looking at for most people who are healthy, you know, they get Omicron. They're sick for 5 days. They feel better in the 6th day. They're not shedding virus on the 10th or 11th day. So go get boosted on day 12. But if you're not so healthy, it might take you 8 days to feel better, or 10 days. So it's a little different for everybody. There's no blanket answer. There's a range. Biology is very loosey goosey because all the people
The
are
longer
different.
the better. But
Yeah.
thanks, Tom.
The longer the better, but no, it's not the longer. It's more. See, one of the reasons that we say you shouldn't get a vaccine when you're sick. Okay, one of the clinical reasons that we say you shouldn't get a flu vaccine when you're sick. You shouldn't get a measles vaccine when you're feeling sick. Is if we give you a vaccine, and then you start developing fever and chills, is that from the vaccine or is that because you're still sick? It's a confounder. So then when you see the doctor and you say, I've got fevers and chills, if it's from the vaccine, we'll say, oh, it's from the vaccine, you'll be fine. Just take 2 Tylenol and the vaccine effect goes away in 24 hours. I mean, everybody felt that. They got their booster and, you know, they were fine 2 days later. But if you're sick and just getting over a sickness and then you start getting fevers and chills, could it be your sickness getting worse? Are you developing pneumonia from your original sickness? So that's one reason why we don't like to vaccinate until you're well.
Tommy,
Yeah.
Doc, I
Yes.
just want to share. Last week, one people living here in the condo, in our unit, got Omicron,
Mm-hmm.
and the next day, two other the house help also got it.
Mm-hmm.
So I quarantined them to their own rooms, but thank God it's the 7th day now. I am fine.
Yeah.
I had, as you remember, I had a serious case of COVID in August of 2020.
Yeah.
I got my first vaccine on Feb of 21,
Okay.
Moderna. My second shot was also Moderna in March of 2020,
Mm-hmm.
2021.
2021.
I got my booster, which was funny, in late August,
Of
but they
2021.
gave me
Okay.
Pfizer. They gave me
Mm-hmm.
Pfizer. So I had so I'm a survivor, Moderna, and Pfizer.
Yeah.
And
And that's
it
fine.
looked like it worked. It looked like it worked
Mhm.
because I got protected from,
Yeah.
I just wanted to share that the
Yeah.
vaccines do work. And I
They do
have
work.
severe comorbidities too. So I'm thankful for the vaccine.
Yeah.
So
And then what you guys have
thank you.
to,
And so, yeah, go ahead.
so people who've had their booster, you know, you're fine for, nobody's quite sure with Omicron, okay? But the thinking is you'll probably be fine for 4, 6, 8, 9 months. You have to follow the data because Omicron's new. So the data as to how long is your booster effective for, it's going to take 4, 5, 6, 7 months to figure that out. You know, I can't look into the future and say it. Everything we know is because we've been watching the Israelis because they're the first ones to get their first shots and their first boosters. So as data comes out from watching antibody levels in Israel, we're going to be able to make better projections as to how long this is all going to be for. So you've got to stay tuned. This is, you know, I keep making this World War II analogy. You got to keep up with the war news. What's going on at the front? The front is Israel because that's where they all got vaccinated first.
So
Okay,
another
that's-
question from B Toda.
Benji,
Mhm.
Benji Toda.
Benji.
Benji.
Hi, Benji.
Hi, how are you?
Good, thank you.
Tommy. Okay. My driver got sick. I sent him home and in 9 days he was cleared of the virus. He showed me a
Okay.
test and I tested him here because I have these tests and none he was not positive anymore. Why? And he was vaccinated.
Did you get vaccinated and boosted?
No, not boosted, just vaccinated.
Yeah, generally healthy person.
Healthy, driver, yeah, healthy.
Yeah. Yeah. So
I
so
know that.
so
Yeah.
yeah. So he was diagnosed with COVID. He had a positive antigen swab,
Yes, we tested him positive. We sent him
positive
home.
antigen test. Yeah. Okay. And then how did he feel at home?
He was hiding it. So when
Was he
we,
feeling sick or was he?
well, he wasn't showing it, but he was masked, and I was going with him, but I didn't get it.
Are you boosted?
No, not yet. I'm boosting in February.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if
I
he's
wanted to
wearing a
ask,
mask,
I wanted to ask you: is the new boosters are they going to be against Omicron or no? Not yet.
no, all the boosters that are available are the same vaccine that was invented in January 2021.
Yes,
So Moderna and Pfizer
I'm getting a
are
Moderna booster.
they built a vaccine against the original Wuhan strain.
Okay,
And that all the vaccines are based on that. Nobody has yet made an Omicron specific vaccine.
really?
But yeah, it's not.
How
And
can
that's
we
one
share?
reason why that's I'm sorry. That's one reason why there's
Close the share.
breakthrough because Omicron is different enough from the original Wuhan strain to
Yes.
basically evade the vaccine a little bit. Okay,
Okay.
it's not perfect, but so the booster raises your antibody levels a little bit. The booster also triggers your T cells to be wary, and
Yes.
so the booster does help a lot. If you
Okay.
meet Omicron and you've had a booster, you'll be much better able to resist it than somebody who hasn't. Okay.
Yes.
Now your driver, I mean, everybody's a little different. There's no perfect textbook case of this.
Yes.
Number one, what's his overall health? Number two, how much virus did he actually inhale? Number three, some people get, they've had their 2 shots of Sinovac and they get Omicron and they're sick for 7 days and then they're fine.
Yes.
Some people shed for 12 days, some people shed for 9 days. It's
Yes.
not, these 5 day, 10 day
had-
are not cut and dry.
Tommy, I had Sinovac and I've had Moderna. 2 shots of
Okay. Oh, so you've had your booster.
No, not a booster. 2 shots. Both
Yeah.
of them 2 shots.
Okay, think about it this way, okay?
So do I
Two
need a booster
Sinovacs,
or no more?
yeah. Your first 2 vaccines, no matter what they are, your first 2 Sinovacs, your first 2 Modernas, your first 2 Pfizers, okay?
Yeah.
That's considered your primary series, okay?
Okay.
If you're a normal person, not immunocompromised, not taking prednisone, no immunodeficiency, your primary series is the first 2 vaccines you got, whatever they were.
Yes.
Okay, and then an extra shot, a third shot, is your booster.
Yeah, no, I had two, and then I had 2 because they said Sinovac is useless. So they got me 2 shots of Moderna.
Okay,
So now
that's
I'm
all you need.
3rd shot of booster or no more?
No, you don't need it. You don't need it.
No. Okay.
The WHO says if you've had 2 Sinovacs and 1 Moderna, you're fine.
Okay.
So
I
you've
had
got
two
more. You've
Moderna.
had more than you need, and that's one reason why you didn't get sick from your driver.
Okay.
You've already had your primary series, and
Yeah,
you've
but he
had 2
wears a mask
boosters.
and I wear a mask and shield. So
Yeah. So all those things work, and you didn't get sick. It works.
Yeah.
All the prevention things work.
yeah.
Okay, Bert, you have a question? You had your hand raised.
Yes. I have a question which some of our classmates already know of, and you might find it a little bit funny, Doc Tommy.
Yeah.
My backdoor neighbor wears a strong perfume, and when I walk along my backyard, I can smell it. So does that mean that there is virus floating around and I should wear a mask?
I don't think so. Well, you should always wear a mask. I mean, if you're around other people that you suspect, but if you're outdoors and you smell a perfume, there's no correlation.
There's no correlation. Okay.
No, and you can
Joey?
smell. So.
I'm safe.
Okay, Joey Salinas, do you have a question?
Yes, hi, good morning. Sorry, I can't put on my video. Tommy,
Yeah.
hi. You
Hi,
mentioned,
hi, hi.
hi, this is the first time I hear about virus shedding. So I would like to clarify that the quarantine period for a patient of Omicron is basically 7 days. And then you
Well,
shed the virus after. And a question to that is, while you're shedding, are you contagious?
yes,
Oh, so you shed up to the 12th day, you said, from the 10th to the
possible.
12th
Yeah,
day.
yeah,
So you can
yeah,
still
yeah.
be contagious up to the 12th day?
Yeah, that's why. So the CDC guidelines here, so the original guidelines, okay, if you go back, it was just 10 days, okay. If you've had COVID contact, or if you've had real COVID, quarantine yourself for 10 to 14 days, okay. And that was the original guideline put out a long time ago. You've had an exposure, you stay home for 2 weeks, and you might get sick, you might not, and that is a pretty good guarantee that you won't give it to anybody else. Okay. The trouble is when so many people are getting COVID, you're killing off the workforce. Okay. And one of the things that happened in hospitals in 2021 was so many people had exposures to COVID that there was nobody in the hospital to come to work. There was a shortage of everything. So in a hospital, they said, look, hospitals are the strictest place around. Everybody's scared to death. Everybody wears a mask. We had N95 masks. So we said, look, we really need you, okay? If you've had an exposure and you're not sick and it's already been 5 days at home and you haven't developed any symptoms, please come to work, but do wear your N95 mask.
Yes.
And so you could alleviate the hospital labor shortage by bringing in people who were still quarantining because they had had an exposure but they were feeling fine, but because they were wearing N95s and they were very strict about it, and the hospital is very strict about enforcing it, you could have them back on the workforce. Okay. And that works in hospitals because they're really strict. But if you try that with the general population, well,
Yeah.
who's going to enforce it?
Yeah.
You see? But the trouble is economic forces and social forces are saying, oh, 10 days is too long. Let's make it 5 and just wear a mask for another 5. And look at what we're all trying to do. We're trying to cut that rule down to, how little can we make it? The reality is 2 weeks, it covers everything, but nobody wants to pay that price. So we're haggling it down. And as we haggle it down to 10 days, 9 days, because I feel fine, well, then you're going to see this 10% of people are still shedding virus on day 10. That really happens. So 14 days is nice and safe, but society can't seem to afford it. Okay? And as we trim it, the problem again becomes human behavior. Are the humans who are now allowed to go out after 5 days going to comply with wearing an N95 mask? And no, they don't.
We have 21 days in Hong Kong.
Yeah, that's why they do that. Well, that's a little extreme, but yeah, but that's why, ideally quarantine is 14 days, but nobody wants to pay the price. This is human nature. We want to see how close can we cut it, and we're going to slip. And if one person is shedding the virus, he can give it to 3 other people. And so the virus keeps on propagating. The virus wins.
May I go next, Tommy? Dave
Yes.
here.
Dave, hi.
Hi. I get the impression that catching COVID is airborne.
I'm sorry, you get the impression
I
that...
get the impression that you catch COVID via air transmission.
Yes, it's airborne. Mm-hmm.
Right. So what is the reason for the hand washing regimen? If it's airborne?
You should touch your face.
Yeah. So the hand washing was really something that was there when we weren't sure about COVID. Okay? So when COVID first came out, everybody thought it was a little bit like the flu. And the flu is spread by droplets. And so with droplets, you get it on your hands, and then you shake hands and give it to somebody else. But it turns out it took about a year and a half to prove that COVID was aerosol. And aerosol is actually worse than droplets because aerosol goes further. So with aerosol, they realized, well, the hand washing is still important, but the business of wiping off all your packages, wiping off all the surfaces, that's not so important anymore. Now that we understand it better, hand washing still helps because we cough into our hands, we touch ourselves, so who knows if we contaminate our hands. But it's certainly, given how we're not shaking hands anymore, and everybody is bumping elbows, it's become less important. Your hand is not as much of a vector as it was with flu. The vector is the mask, the cough, the breathing. So if I have COVID, if I have Omicron and I'm not wearing a mask, and you and I sit at the same table and share a meal, I'm going to give it to you, even
Yeah.
though you're sitting at the other side of the table, because every time I talk, it comes out. It's aerosolized.
So the virus can reside in your hand if you how do you say it, sneeze into your hand.
Yes, for sure. Yeah.
And that's the validity or value
That's the
of
validity, yeah, of the hand washing, yeah. But if we're very good about wearing masks and we're not shaking hands and we're careful about what we touch, then suddenly the hand becomes less important a vector compared to the mask.
Thank you, Tommy. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Benny, do you have a question?
I do. Hi, Tommy. Again,
Hi, Benny.
if you recovered from COVID, is that considered vaccinated? Like, do you get an immunity from it?
Temporarily.
Oh, so it's not considered like it's equivalent to say
No.
a vaccine?
Yeah, there was one slide I showed that showed the data on that. Where if you get real COVID, you're pretty safe for a couple of months, but then it'll fade out. You still have my screen share on? Okay. This is the one that shows about how likely are you to get reinfected after disease recovery. Okay. And if you look at these red bars, if you're recovered and it's been 4 to 6 months, there's like this 10%. But as you get on to 12 months, you're here at 30%. So immunity from natural disease does fade out. Okay. Down here in the blue bars, we're seeing people who recovered then got vaccinated. Okay. And they do much better. So if you're recovered and you get vaccinated, your likelihood of reinfection is much, much lower.
Okay. All right. So I guess from our point of view, it's just getting Djokovic out of the country was probably was very well what do you call it? Justified.
Yeah, no, the anti-vaxxing is just, this is the human behavior part. We have free will, and society respects that. But ideally, free will and decisions are based on reason and on good reasons. And that's one reason why it's so important to see what's empirically true. And hopefully you base your decisions on that rather than whatever you make up in your head.
Tommy, I'm repeating a comment I read earlier. It's not from me. Can your presentation materials be shared with the participants?
Sure. Yeah, there's nobody's saying we can't give boosters this time. This is all public information. I mean, most people don't go to the Next Strain website to look up this stuff, but anybody who wants to can go there. It's nextstrain.org, and if you go there, you can find data on dengue, Zika, COVID, tuberculosis. And I wish more people would go there and see this is the data that all the public health people make their recommendations from. And I would love to see an equivalent database that an anti-vaxxer can point you to.
Yes, but whoever made that comment considers yours to be summarized, precise, and concise. Yeah, not a lot of not a lot of information that a layman cannot understand. And
Yeah, well,
whoever raised that question asked if you can share your presentation material.
sure,
It's not
sure.
from me. I'm just repeating what I read earlier.
Yeah, no problem.
Chingling, do you have a question?
Yeah, I have a couple. One, Tommy, is there such a thing as being overvaxxed? I mean, are there risks to being overvaxxed?
Yes. Again, theoretical. Okay, theoretical. Meaning you own your immune system. Needs so much information. A vaccine is just giving your immune system some information, saying, "Let's make this antibody." Okay. Now, once you have enough antibody, that's all the antibody you need. You don't need more. Okay. Now, in theory, if you keep forcing higher and higher levels of antibody, yeah, there are actually diseases from having too much antibody. There's an interesting disease called multiple myeloma, where your body actually makes way too much gamma globulin and it causes its own problems. That's not going to happen with too much vaccine. But what happens with COVID, if you get more vaccine, a normal, healthy person is just going to ignore it. Imagine this, okay? You've got you're already making antibody. You've got antibodies at a sufficient level to kill off a COVID virus. Okay.
Yeah.
Instead of meeting a virus, you give yourself a vaccine. So the vaccine makes fake viral protein. Well, your antibody is just going to kill that fake viral protein, and that viral protein won't do anything. It's kind of like useless.
Yeah. Okay.
Why did you deprive somebody else of a shot? I mean, that vaccine in you didn't do a darn thing, okay? But you deprived somebody else from becoming immune to COVID. So now that other person is breeding the new mutant strain. Distribute the vaccine. You gotta get that out there to people. Your best protection is to vaccinate everybody.
Yeah. Okay.
Only 11% of the world has had their third booster.
Okay.
Has had their third shot, and that's gotta, with Omicron, if you don't get your third shot, 2 shots shows that you can still get it, and if you get it, you're breeding mutations, and one of those mutations is going to change enough that it's going to come back and kick you, even though you've had 5 shots, because guess what? The new virus mutant is going to break through your 5 shots.
Okay. Yeah, because I have empirical data on antibodies because I have a lot of comorbidities. So with the 2 Sinovacs, it was I went from 89% to 68% from Sinovac after about 3 months. So I had the 2 Modernas, and it jumped up to 98%, and that was in September.
Yes.
So it's now
And that's-
almost 6 months since.
Yeah, and so so if you've got multiple comorbidities and you've got problems, the thinking for people who are ill, okay, not your standard person, but somebody who's a higher risk, is instead of needing 2 shots for your primary series, you actually need 3 shots for your primary series. Okay, so what you got was Sinovac 1 and 2, and then Moderna, and that's your primary series. Sinovac 1 and 2 were not enough for you.
Correct.
Okay?
Yes.
But in those days, nobody was giving a 3rd shot. Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
But you, because you got Sinovac 1 and 2, and then got Moderna 1, have now completed your primary series. Okay?
Right. Then I got Moderna
And then
2.
you got a booster. Yeah.
Yeah.
Moderna 2 is your booster, and so you're fine. That'll hold you off for the next 6 to 8 months.
Okay, but 6 to 8 months, I should probably test for antibodies again.
Yes, yeah, because you're not the standard healthy person.
Correct.
Yes, you should check for antibodies again, and
Correct.
and those kinds of decisions are really something between you and your doctor. Okay, for me to be here in Boston giving medical advice is, I mean, you're a special case.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so it's that the decision for the next shot is really between you and your doctor. But the general thinking is people who are immunocompromised, who have multiple comorbidities, who for some reason have immune systems that don't work so well,
Yes.
will probably need that extra fourth shot, but that's really something to discuss with your doctor.
Right. Right. Okay.
Okay?
The second question is on the tests. The
Mhm.
difference between the nasal swab, and there are two. There's the deep
Mhm.
nasal swab and the new pro bio or whatever we call it. More
Yeah.
shallower nasal swab, and
Yeah.
then the RT-PCR. There are those that say that the saliva is less what indicative than the nasal, and
Yeah. So
RT-PCR on the other hand, they say might detect some other previous infections or something.
well, okay. So here's your anatomy. Can you guys still see my screen?
Yes.
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 Okay. So here's the anatomy, okay? This is your nasopharynx. Here's the nose. Okay, so if you put your so when you inhale virus, okay, when you inhale an aerosol, that aerosol travels through your nose and then has to make this 90-degree turn to get down to your windpipe and cause problems. Okay, this whole upper airway is designed to kind of trap particles. Big particles get trapped here, smaller particles get trapped here, smaller particles get trapped here, and some stuff makes it down. Okay, so if you're going to try to get a sample, you got to ask how big is the particle. Well, the coronavirus is pretty small, so when it goes in, it tends to get stuck here. You know, imagine airflow. You inhale this way, bam, and then it's got to go down here. Okay, so the most sensitive place to pick up a virus is back here in the back of the nose. They call this the nasopharynx. Okay, and this is what we were doing in my hospital. We had these swabs that were very long and thin and flexible, and you have to know your anatomy to be able to go down there and do it. So this was done by trained nurses, doctors. Okay, if you have to test a lot of people and you don't have enough trained people to do this, then you say, well, look, we got to get the tests, but if you don't know what you're doing, you can hurt somebody. So let's go up here. You know, it's easier. Okay, but it's you're not gonna get as much virus. So if you have a very small amount of virus here and you swab here, you're gonna show a negative test. Okay, but if you wait a day or two, this virus will multiply, and now you've got a lot of virus all over here. So if you test with a swab here, it'll be positive. So the different tests have different sensitivities based on the technique of where are you going to sample. Okay, it's hard to sample here. You got to know what you're doing. It's easy to sample here. Now, the other problem is what assay are you going to use to detect the virus? Okay, the PCR test, which was the one first done, is very sensitive, okay? But it's a very complicated lab test to run. It takes a minimum of 8 hours for the machine to actually run the test because it's so complicated, okay? It's you have to clone the antibody, et cetera, et cetera. While, but it's by far the most sensitive. But if you want the result right away, then you swab and do an antigen assay. The antigen assay is probably 4 to 8 times less sensitive than the PCR. So the antigen test, which is cheap and fast, will show you if you have a fair amount of virus. But it'll show negative if you have very little virus. But repeated 2 days later, it'll be positive. So an antigen test, which you get to see in 15, 20 minutes, can be negative and can be a false negative because it missed it. Okay.
Okay. What about the saliva?
So there's some talk about with Omicron, does Omicron propagate so fast that you can begin to see it? You see, the mouth is here, okay?
Right.
So if the Omicron is here propagating, if it's propagating really fast, can we find it by sticking a swab into your throat and touching the lower part of your throat? You see, the first place for the virus to settle is up here, nasopharynx. You can only get there through your nose, okay? But the thinking is maybe the virus will propagate down here to the back of the throat and begin to be in your saliva. And so you can sample the saliva and maybe pick up virus a little better. And the thinking with Omicron is that it's multiplying so fast that maybe you can do that. But I don't think the jury's really out on it yet. It's just that if you're going to do home testing, you want a test that's easy. So saliva is really easy to sample, but how good, is it going to miss? Yeah, it's going to miss, but it's better than nothing. So all the antigen tests, saliva, nasal swab, if they're positive, they're really positive. You've got COVID. If they're negative, they could be false negatives. Okay? So every time you interpret a negative test, you have to ask yourself, what is my risk of the disease? Okay? So if I were to test you for influenza, and you haven't been around anybody with influenza, okay? And influenza is not really going around in the Philippines right now, and the test came back negative, I'd be pretty confident that that's a true negative, because really the probability of having influenza is fairly low anyway, okay? But if you've been around 5 people who tested positive for COVID, and I test you and it's negative, I would say, look, that could be a false negative. Let's repeat the test in 2 days because I'm very suspicious because of your history. And this is why test by itself isn't the whole story. There's always a clinical history that you have to correlate with the test.
Tom Dave Kuyukyat here.
Yes, Dave.
I'm looking at the picture you're showing on the screen. Is there any theory or explanation as to why Omicron does not go deep down into the lungs versus the Delta? Why it stays in the upper part of the body?
Yeah. There were some very interesting experiments done in Hong Kong early on with Omicron, and they showed that when you work with viruses, you have to grow them in tissue. So there's something called tissue culture, where you can get tissue from the lungs and grow it on a petri dish. You can get tissue from the bronchi and grow it on a petri dish. And what they showed was Omicron grows a lot better on the tissue here than it actually does in the lung tissue. So, when you plate Omicron on these things, it just grows better in the bronchi and not as well in the lung. So it becomes more of a bronchial disease than lung, which is great because it's not as lethal.
Yeah.
And that's just the way it is. The receptors for the Omicron, for whatever reason, or its ability to replicate, is much better in the bronchi than it is in the lung. But, why down at the molecular level, nobody's really sure. But thank God, because it's so contagious.
Thank you, Tommy. Thank you.
Can I just follow up on the testing one more? Is there a
Okay.
relationship between, when you're positive, that the T part, you have a second line?
Yeah.
Is there a relationship between the darkness of that second line and the level of your infection? A lighter line means less infection?
Yeah, you could argue that the more virus you have, the faster that line will develop. I mean,
Okay.
you're supposed to read it after 15 minutes, but
Right.
sometimes you'll see it positive in 5 minutes.
Okay, but you
And
don't
that
know whether
usually
that lightness isn't that you're in the beginning of your infection or you're lessening in the infection, you're coming out of it.
No, you
Right?
don't know that. No,
Right.
that's a clinical study. That's a clinical
Okay.
picture. Yeah. All
Got
it's
it.
saying is there's virus there. We see
Yeah.
virus, but we can't tell you.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Benji, did you have another question?
Yes, I had, yes. Okay, Tommy.
Yeah.
Okay. In this, you show the virus still going into the lungs.
Oh, that's Delta.
Yeah, no, the Omicron.
Oh,
It's
it
still
can,
there.
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, Omicron definitely can go in the lungs. I mean, you've got a lot of people who've not been vaccinated who have Omicron, and it gets to their lungs.
Okay. But if I'm vaccinated 2 times, then I
Yeah,
don't worry about this.
probably won't. Yeah, most of the people. So the people who are really sick from Omicron with lung and pneumonia and ventilators and ICU, 98% of them are unvaccinated.
Okay, okay, okay. Thank you.
Yeah, a few people who are vaccinated do end up in the ICU, but those people are usually multiple comorbidities. They've got diabetes, they've got hypertension, they've got heart disease, they're 90 years old, and they're taking steroids.
Okay, yes, yes.
Okay, I think we're going to take a few more questions because we are now going to 11 o'clock. It's 2 hours.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to tire Tommy soon. How about Bert? Bert, you still have a question?
Yeah, I have a question on your earlier point, Dr. Tommy, regarding
Sure.
sanitizing grocery items. I've got a big load in my backyard which I'm quarantining. So the only way that the way I heard your explanation is the only way they can be infected by the virus is if someone in the supermarket sneezes in front of it, or maybe sneezes on his hands and then touches it. Is that correct?
Well, not quite. You have to. Okay, so here's the story with sanitation and the keeping it clean. If you go back in the beginning, where nobody knew anything about, COVID. It's a new disease. Okay, we were saying, oh my gosh, it probably behaves like the flu, and if there's droplet spread, droplets will end up on your groceries. You will touch your groceries, and then when you touch your groceries, you're going to touch your face, because we all touch our face periodically. Okay, and then when you touch your face, you're going to give yourself the virus. That's pretty much how flu works. Somebody with flu coughs on their hand. They cough on their hand, they handle the groceries. You then handle the groceries with your hands. You touch your face, you give yourself the flu. Okay? Well, you can interrupt that chain by washing your hands. Okay? So even though the groceries have been coughed on by a grocery worker, if you handle the groceries, after you handle the groceries, just wash your hands. And then you touch your face, and you're not going to get it. Now, as far as we know, Omicron and Delta are not really eaten. It's not really a GI disease. Or if it gets into your GI tract, it doesn't really cause pathology. Okay? So with time going by, and then the other thing they were saying was Omicron can live on a surface for 3 days. So people would get groceries, put them someplace for 3 days before touching them. Well, it turns out, again, if you wash your hands, you're not going to get the Omicron, and if you eat it, it's not really going to cause a problem. It's aerosol. So they're stressing the hand washing and the quarantining of groceries for 3 days. Turns out that wasn't so important. The most important is the mask, and the mask has to fit well, because this is where it gets you. It enters you through here. This is where your receptors for it are, and this is where it causes its damage. So they were overly cautious when they did that in 2020, but not so important anymore.
Okay, I'll bring in the groceries then.
Yeah, you can bring in the groceries. And just wash your hands, Everything that we all learned when we were kids, what your mom told you, wash your hands before you eat, wash your hands before you touch your face, because the vector is your hand. You touch something with Omicron, wash your hands, and it won't get to you.
Thanks for coming.
Okay.
Sure.
Mike, you have a question?
Yes, Tommy, hi. Good to see
Hi.
you.
Mike. Yeah.
Mike, hi, there you are. Okay. Sorry, I've got all these things on my screen, and I wasn't
Okay.
sure.
I heard you say that people with comorbidities and multiple types of problems and taking steroids. What do you mean taking steroids? How does that affect you're getting the virus?
Steroids. Yeah, steroids will. One of the side effects of steroids is it depresses your immune system.
Okay.
So if you're taking steroids, 20 milligrams of Medrol a day, and you get a shot, a vaccine, you're just not going to make as much antibody as somebody who's not taking the Medrol.
Okay, because the reason I ask is I have some allergies that my doctor, my pulmo has prescribed me with this nasal spray, and
That
has
doesn't
some
count.
steroid. That doesn't count.
No,
Okay.
no, nasal spray. The nice thing about the nasal sprays is they're topical. They're not going to depress your immunity. You can
Okay.
certainly get a vaccine, and it's not going to be affected by the nasal sprays.
Okay. So the Montelukast, the Cycast, they've got a little steroid, but that's not.
No,
That's
no.
not.
All the Montelukast does not suppress your immunity. That works with the mast cell release, which is totally unrelated.
Okay.
The bad one is oral Medrol. That's a real oral steroid.
Okay. So including the Seretide that I puff once or twice a day as
That's fine.
anti-asthma. That's fine. Okay.
Those are fine. Yeah, those are all
It's more.
topical.
Yeah, it's more of a preventive for me. The
Yeah.
doctor said just
No,
don't stop
if you're-
taking it. He said.
Yeah, just to be clear, if you're using inhaled steroids like asthma sprays or nasal
Yeah.
sprays or topical steroids for a rash, those are all fine. Those are not going to
Okay.
suppress your systemic immune system. That's not
Okay.
considered high risk.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hey, Tommy. For you, Kat.
Hey, Tommy, it's
For you,
Nazi.
Kat.
Nazi, hi, where are
Sorry,
you?
please. Nazi, please.
Hey, excuse me,
Good to see
Tommy.
you.
So just a quick one. So that's the same as the prednisone for the eye.
Yeah, that's too small a dose to affect your immunity. That's not going to
Okay.
do it. You'll be fine.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Sure.
Tommy, my turn. Dave, you,
Yes,
Kat.
Dave. Yes.
Our medical advisors, plural, are for a second booster or a total of 4 shots. What's your own opinion about the second booster or a total of 4 shots?
It's necessary in people who are at higher risk. Okay, and so the population of people with higher risk are all those things that we displayed in this slide. Where's this slide about from Israel? This one. Okay. So the older you are, these are confounding variables for being worse with COVID. Okay. So the worst is if you're immunosuppressed because you're not making much antibody. Okay.
Okay.
And the people who are immunosuppressed, people taking Medrol because they've got they've got lupus or something, or they've got very bad asthma and they're taking Medrol, they're considered immunosuppressed. The other risk factors are being very old. The older you are, the more of a risk. Okay. If you've got diabetes, that's very difficult to control. If you've got chronic kidney failure and you're on dialysis, these are all risk factors that say you should probably get a 4th shot. Smoking, well, I mean, how bad are your lungs? You know, if your smoking is so bad that you've got chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, you should probably get a 4th booster. So these are all things you've got to discuss with your doctor. It's case by case, because your doctor will know your personal history and how many of these risk factors you've got. They do add up. I mean, if you've got just one, it's not so bad. But if you've got 6 of these, then by all means get a 4th booster. Get that 4th shot. And that's because when you've got these risk factors, your immune system is not working as well.
Yes.
So yeah, people with all these problems get a 4th shot. But for the general population, that 1 booster is fine. But you got to stay tuned to this station, because over time, 6 months from now, who knows what the new data is going to be? Who knows if there's going to be an Omicron booster? This is, like everybody said, this story changes every month.
Okay.
Okay. Can I wrap it up by saying that it seems, Tommy, that old age is something that we're all in. So I think the fourth booster is gonna have to come in sometime soon.
Well, that's why I gave you this range of 4 to 8 months. Okay.
Yeah, but age is up there. My God.
Yeah. So if you're a generally healthy person, if you look at the Israeli studies, generally healthy people, they don't really bother boosting them until 8 or 9 months down the line.
Okay.
Generally healthy people who work in a hospital ICU who are exposed to COVID every day, they're going to get a 4th booster. You know, if you're 100 years old, but that's your only risk factor, well, yeah, you'll probably get a fourth booster. But if you're 70 and otherwise generally healthy, you can probably wait 7 months. You know, so there's a lot of play there. But yes, the disappointment is that over time, no matter how healthy you are, that that antibody level begins to go down. And if you get a nasty bug like Omicron, you should get boosted. Which is why in the US now they're saying everybody over 16 gets a shot. And they're even saying give it to children now that they figured out what the pediatric doses are.
John, may I? This is a simple question. On the screen
Last question.
table 2, row 3, it says male sex. What
Yes.
actually does it mean?
Males have a worse outcome than females when you get bad COVID.
So why sex?
Male as in
you mean sex is the gender?
yes, yeah, male gender. Yeah.
Okay, I understand. I thought it's sexual activity.
You can have
no,
less
worry.
than no, Dave. You may indulge. You may indulge.
Dave.
Indulge, yeah.
It's the
That's
gender. I understand now. It's gender.
Well, it just goes to show that not only is the age thing, but also the male thing, and we are doomed, all males. Okay. On that note, can we all thank and give Tommy a big clap, thanking him for his.
Thank you, Tommy.
Thank you, Tommy.
Thank you.
Great talk. Thank you, Tommy.
Thank you.
It was fun.
Thank
It
you.
makes me it makes me keep up with this stuff. The trouble with being retired is you start getting lazy and you're not reading the stuff anymore.
Tommy, baby.
Nice to see everyone.
Thank you so much, Tommy, for all your preparation.
Hi, JJ.
Thank you,
Hi,
Tommy.
JJ. Good to see you. You take care of yourself, JJ.
Thank you, John.
Okay.
Thank you, John.
Good
Thank you, John, too.
Bye, Mike.
Mike, good to see you.
Thank you, Tommy.
Thank you, Tommy.
Nice seeing you,
Stay
Dave.
safe.
Thank
you, Tommy.
Thank you,
John.
Dr.
Remember,
Tommy.
it's a human vector.
Thank you,
Okay,
Tommy.
so all
Thank
of
you,
us
Tommy.
human vectors have to play a role in preventing spread.
Thanks a lot, Tommy.
Okay.
Okay,
Thank you, Tommy.
Maybe in several months
Bye.
we'll bring Tommy back and give us more dope on how to survive this Omicron.
Right.
On that note, thank you very much all
Thank you,
for
John.
attending.
Thank you, John. Thank you, John.
Thank you, John.
Thank you,
John.
Tom.
Thank you, John.
Thank you,
Thank you,
John.
guys.
Thanks,
Thank you.
John.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Chris.
Tommy.
Tommy.
Bye.
Chris.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, John.
Bye.
Tommy.
Bye-bye.
Yep.
I'm
Okay,
Tom.
Hey, Jerry.
Oh, Tom. Okay, Tom.
Okay,
Jerry.
Next one on the
big
meds.
smile.
Right.
Tom, next one on the new medicines.
Yeah, as they become more as they become available. Right now, the problem is nobody can get it. So we'll have data on the medicines in a couple of months. You'll
That's
see.
the oral ones, right, Tommy?
Yeah, the oral ones. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah.
There's going to be
Morning
new stuff.
Morning after pills.
Yeah, morning after pill. Exactly. 4-day regimen. So.
Well, we must not forget to thank Tricia Lichauco for her support. Aside from
Thank you, Tricia.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you.
Okay, guys.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you for being
Bye.
here. Nice
Thank
to
you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah, Dave.
Take care, JJ. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Dave.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Nice seeing all of you.
Meeting.